The air in Sura, Seoul's most exclusive Korean barbecue restaurant, smelled of three things: grilling galbi, 100-year-old oak, and the silent, suffocating weight of money. For Zola, standing perfectly still by the service bar, it mostly smelled like survival. Each marble slab of beef sizzling on a tableside grill represented another hour of care for her grandmother. Each clink of a premium scotch bottle against a crystal glass was another fraction of the payment for the specialized facility that kept Mama Grace safe from the fog of Alzheimer's. A facility whose bill was a monstrous, soul-crushing $8,000 a month. Her skin, the color of rich, dark soil, often drew a second glance in a room where the clientele and most of the staff shared a pale porcelain uniformity. Her hair was braided into a severe crown, tucked away as neatly as the past she never spoke of. The uniform, a simple black dress, crisp and functional, was a marker of her class, a cloak of invisibility she wore with practiced ease. Her hands, long-fingered and steady, could arrange a dozen intricate banchan dishes with the precision of a surgeon, but they trembled slightly when she thought of the next wire transfer. And her eyes, the color of dark honey, missed nothing. They were the eyes of an analyst, trained to see patterns in chaos, a skill utterly wasted on memorizing which chaebol heir preferred his soju, chilled to exactly 3 degrees Celsius. The restaurant was a theater of hierarchy, and Zola knew her role. She was scenery, background, a silent, efficient ghost who refilled water glasses and replaced hot grills. She tolerated the casual dismissiveness, the occasional muttered slur from a drunk patron, the way they looked through her as if she were made of glass. She tolerated it because Mama Grace, the woman who had saved her from the wreckage of the foster care system, deserved the dignity in her twilight years that Zola had to sacrifice daily to afford. The irony was a constant bitter taste in her mouth. The restaurant manager, Mr. Kim, scurried out from the back, his face slick with a nervous sweat that his cologne couldn't mask. He wrung his hands, his knuckles white. "Listen up," he hissed, his voice a frantic whisper that barely carried over the genteel hum of the dining room. "Park Min-jun is on his way, with guests. The VIP room, Hana. I want flawless service. No mistakes. Do you understand? Flawless." A ripple of fear went through the staff. Park Min-jun, the owner's son. His visits were theatrical displays of cruelty, and he always needed an audience. He was a man whose power was entirely inherited, a flimsy construct of his father's reputation, which made him dangerously insecure. Zola's posture remained unchanged, but inside, a familiar cold dread settled in her stomach. She had a particular talent for attracting Min-jun's attention. Her quiet dignity seemed to provoke him, her stillness a challenge to his loud, performative dominance. She deliberately kept her gaze lowered, focusing on polishing a wine glass until it was impossibly clear, a small act of control in a world where she had none. For a fleeting second, she allowed herself to remember a different life. A sterile, windowless room in Fort Meade, Maryland, the hum of servers her only company, her fingers flying across a keyboard as she tracked illicit financial transfers through the dark web. A life where her mind was a weapon, not a vessel for drink orders. The memory was a ghost, a painful reminder of a world she had lost. She had been good. Too good. She'd followed a money trail that led somewhere politically inconvenient, and her career, her life, had been neatly and quietly dismantled. Now she was here. In a far corner of the restaurant, an old man sat alone, a regular who came once a week. He was always unassuming, dressed in a simple but well-cut gray suit. He nursed a single pot of tea for hours, watching the room with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades. The staff called him Halebeoji, grandfather, out of respect. He always nodded to Zola, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that was different from the blank stares of the others. It was a flicker of recognition, man to woman, not master to servant. She gave him a small nod back before turning her attention to the entrance. The heavy oak doors swung open. The arrival of Park Min-jun was an event. He didn't just walk into a room, he conquered it. 2 younger men, clones in expensive, ill-fitting suits, flanked him. The low chatter in the dining room faltered, then resumed at a more subdued pitch. Heads turned, waiters froze. Min-jun paused at the threshold, a predator surveying his territory. He was handsome in a vapid billboard sort of way, his suit a vibrant blue that screamed for attention. On his wrist was a watch, a Patek Philippe, whose price could have paid for Mama Grace's care for a year, maybe two. His hair was artfully disheveled. His eyes, however, were cold and empty. They swept the room, cataloging, dismissing. Then they found Zola. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He didn't acknowledge Mr. Kim, who was bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the floor. He walked straight towards the service bar where Zola stood, perfectly still. "You." His voice was deceptively soft, yet it cut through the room's ambiance. "Prepare the Hana room, and bring a pot of the Wagi green tea, the special reserve." "Yes, sir." Zola's voice was a neutral, deferential murmur. She moved to comply, her movements economical and precise. She could feel his eyes on her back, a physical weight. She could feel the pitying glances of her co-workers, the uncomfortable shifting of the other patrons. This was the overture. The performance was about to begin. She entered the Hana room, a private space walled with dark wood and a single, stunning ink-wash painting of a bamboo forest. The table was already set. She checked every detail: the polished silver, the pristine white porcelain, the precisely folded napkins. Everything was perfect. Her perfection was her shield. When she returned with the tray, a heavy iron pot of steaming tea and 4 delicate cups, Min-jun and his guests were already seated. He was laughing, a loud, braying sound that grated on the nerves. "And this one?" he said, gesturing to her with a flick of his wrist, his words a lazy drawl. "She's like a statue, isn't she? I'm not even sure she's real." His friends snickered. Zola began to pour the tea, her hands steady, her face an impassive mask. She moved around the table, a silent wraith. The scent of the expensive tea, usually so calming, was now acrid with dread. Min-jun switched to Korean, his tone dripping with condescending amusement, assuming, as everyone always did, her complete lack of comprehension. "Look at her face," he said to his friends, the language a barrier he thought was impenetrable. "Just a blank, stupid animal. You can find them on any street corner in America, begging for change. My father insists we hire them for diversity." What a joke. She probably can't even count. Zola didn't flinch. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of her own making. Survival, she told herself. Just survival. Mama Grace. The words were a mantra, a prayer against the rising tide of fury. She had endured worse, whispers in a secure facility, the cold dismissal of a superior officer, the quiet ruin of her life. This was just noise. She finished pouring for his 3 guests and moved to his side. He watched her, a smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying this, the power, the humiliation, the captive audience. As she carefully tilted the heavy pot to fill his cup, he shifted his leg, knocking the table hard. It was a deliberate, calculated movement. The jolt was violent. The heavy iron pot lurched in her grip. Scalding hot tea, nearly boiling, cascaded over the back of her hand and wrist. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her arm. A strangled gasp escaped her lips, the only sound she allowed herself. The pot crashed onto the table, shattering a cup and sending more hot liquid splashing across the expensive wood. The room fell into a deathly silence. It was the silence of a collective, held breath. The sizzling of the grill at the next table sounded like a forest fire. Min-jun leaned back in his chair, a look of faux concern on his face that was more insulting than outright malice. "Oh dear," he said in English, his voice oozing insincere sympathy. "How clumsy. You've made a terrible mess. And you've burned yourself." He pulled out his phone. "We should get a picture of this, a lesson in hiring competent staff." His friends laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. One of them raised his own phone, the camera lens a cold, black eye. Zola stood frozen. The pain was a living thing, a fire devouring the skin on her hand. She could feel it blistering already, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. It was the filming, the laughter, the reduction of her to a spectacle, a piece of clumsy, dark-skinned furniture for their amusement. 3 seconds. That's what she gave herself. 3 seconds to decide. 1. The image of Mama Grace's face, serene and peaceful in her sunlit room. The bill. The crushing weight of her responsibility. Survival. Dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford. 2. The cold, indifferent face of her former commanding officer as he told her she was being permanently reassigned. The memory of her foster father, a small-time bookie from Busan, teaching her Korean not in a classroom, but in back alleys and smoky pool halls. "You have to know their language better than they do, Zolaya," he'd say. "That's where the real power is." 3. The black, unblinking lens of the phone camera, the sound of their laughter, the absolute soul-crushing certainty that if she did nothing, a piece of her would die here, in this room, on this polished floor. A piece that would never grow back. Her choice was made. The trembling in her body stopped. The mask of deference on her face didn't shatter. It dissolved, replaced by a stillness so absolute it was terrifying. She slowly, deliberately, straightened her spine. It was a small movement, but the shift in the room was seismic. She raised her head and for the first time looked Park Min-jun directly in the eye. The pain in her arm was a distant signal. Her mind was a shard of ice. She looked at the phone in his friend's hand, then back at Min-jun, and she spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was quiet, deadly quiet, and it was in perfect fluent Korean. Not the clean academic Korean of Seoul, but the rough, idiomatic, gangster-inflected dialect of Busan's waterfront docks. "Tell your puppy to put his toy away," she said, her tone as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. "Unless you want me to shove it down his throat and broadcast his stupidity to the entire Jeomeon Taeyang syndicate." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb being disarmed. Park Min-jun froze. The color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, mottled gray. The smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. His friends stared, their phones forgotten in their hands. They understood the words, but they couldn't process the source. It was like a dog had suddenly started reciting Shakespeare. Zola didn't wait for a response. She turned her attention to the mess on the table. With her uninjured hand, she picked up the broken pieces of the porcelain cup. "You also chose the wrong tea," she continued in the same chillingly calm Busan dialect. "The Hwage Reserve has a delicate profile. It should be brewed at 80 degrees, not boiling. You've burned the leaves. It's a waste. But I suppose a man who knows so little about his own business can't be expected to understand subtlety." She placed the broken shards neatly on the tray. Her burned hand throbbed, a furious, pulsing rhythm, but her movements were unwavering. "And," she added, her eyes flicking back to his, "you're a fool for discussing the Qingdao port deal in a room that isn't swept for bugs, especially when you're planning to skim 20% off the top of Chairman Kwan's share. He considers that kind of thing disrespectful." If Min-jun had been pale before, he was now translucent. A fine sheen of sweat popped out on his forehead. This wasn't just an employee talking back. This was an existential threat. The name Chairman Kwan hung in the air like a death sentence. Who are you?" he stammered in Korean, his voice a choked whisper. Zola allowed a small, cold smile to touch her lips. It didn't reach her eyes. "Just a waitress," she said, switching back to placid, deferential English. "With good ears." She picked up the tray. Her burned hand screamed in protest, but she ignored it. Dignity. This was what it felt like. Not a gift, not a luxury, a weapon. She turned and walked out of the room, each step deliberate and measured. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the entire power dynamic of the room collapsing behind her. A structure built on sand washed away by a tide she had just unleashed. In the main dining area, every eye was on her as she walked toward the kitchen. Mr. Kim intercepted her, his face a mask of panic and fury. "What did you do?" he hissed, grabbing her good arm. "What in God's name did you say to him?" Before Zola could answer, a man rose from the corner table. The quiet old man, Hala Beoji. He had been forgotten in the drama, a piece of the scenery. But as he stood, the entire restaurant seemed to shift its center of gravity toward him. He wasn't tall or physically imposing, but he moved with an authority that was absolute. He walked toward them, his steps unhurried. The two men who had been flanking Park Min-jun's table earlier suddenly appeared at the old man's side, their heads bowed. He stopped in front of Zola and Mr. Kim. His eyes, ancient and sharp, took in her burned hand, then moved to her face. He completely ignored the sputtering manager. His gaze was not pitying, it was assessing. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time since she'd lost her old life, Zola felt seen. Then another figure appeared at the entrance. He moved with a liquid grace that was at odds with his solid frame, flanked by two more men in dark, impeccable suits. The air grew colder. He was tall, his body a study in controlled power beneath a tailored black suit that probably cost more than her car. A platinum watch gleamed on his wrist, but unlike Min Jun's, it wasn't for show. It was a tool. His hair was black, cut short. His face was a mask of cold, handsome indifference. And his eyes. His eyes were the last thing you saw, and the first thing you would remember. They were chips of obsidian, calculating and utterly devoid of emotion. It was him, the man from the rainy night 10 years ago. The student, stranded, his wallet stolen, his face a mask of quiet desperation. She had been on her way home from her university library, clutching the last $20 bill she had to her name. She'd seen the look on his face, a profound loneliness she recognized. Without a word, she had pressed the bill into his hand. "For a taxi," she'd said, before disappearing into the night. He had just looked at her, his eyes wide with a shock that had momentarily broken through his composure. He saw her now. His obsidian eyes widened, just for a fraction of a second. A flicker of recognition. A ghost of a memory. He had not forgotten. He was Kwon Ji-hoon, the chairman's son, the one they called the Shadow, who ran the syndicate's international operations. The man whose name was only ever whispered. His gaze dropped to her burned hand, still clutched at her side. Something dangerous flickered in the depths of his eyes. He looked at the trembling Mr. Kim, then at the closed door of the Hana room. He understood immediately. He walked past them, ignoring everyone, and stopped before the old man. He bowed deeply from the waist. "Father," he said in Korean, his voice a low baritone. "I apologize for the disturbance. Chairman Kwon." The unassuming old man was the head of the entire syndicate. He simply nodded at his son, his eyes still on Zola. Ji-hoon straightened and turned to her. He stood before her, a mountain of quiet menace. The entire restaurant held its breath. "Your hand," he said, his English perfect, his tone flat. "It requires medical attention." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "I'm fine, sir," Zola said, her voice strained. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain was becoming a roaring inferno. He didn't argue. He simply looked at one of the men beside him. "Take her to Dr. Han, now." Then he looked back at her. "You will go with him." It was an order cloaked in the language of concern. Zola met his gaze. In his eyes, she saw not a rescuer, but a strategist who had just identified a new, unexpected asset on the board. He was the catalyst. She would be the reaction. "And the mess in the Hana room?" Zola asked, her voice steady despite the agony in her arm. A ghost of a smile, so faint it was barely there, touched Ji-hoon's lips. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'll clean it up." He turned and walked toward the Hana room, his men falling in behind him. The doors swung shut, and a moment later, a muffled shout of terror and pain was abruptly cut off. Chairman Kwon looked at Zola one last time. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a sign of approval, a promotion. She was no longer scenery. She was now a player in the game. As Ji-hoon's man gently guided her toward a back exit, she knew her life had just been irrevocably fractured for the second time. But this time, she wouldn't be the victim. This time, she would be the one holding the weapon. The clinic was sterile, discreet, and located in the basement of an anonymous building in Gangnam. Dr. Han was a quiet, efficient man who asked no questions as he treated the second-degree burns on Zola's hand and wrist, wrapping them in sterile gauze. The relief from the pain was immense, but her mind was racing. She sat in a small, private waiting room afterward, a cup of barley tea clutched in her good hand. The door opened and Kwon Ji-hoon entered. He moved with a predatory silence that made the air feel thin. He dismissed the doctor and his guards with a flick of his head, leaving the two of them alone. He sat in the chair opposite her, not too close, but near enough that his presence was a tangible force. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He wasn't looking at her. He was studying her bandaged hand as if it were a piece of intelligence. "Park Min-jun has been sent to a re-education facility in Vladivostok," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "He will be taught the value of respect. It will be a long lesson." Zola said nothing. This wasn't an apology. It was a statement of consequences, a demonstration of power. "His father's businesses are being audited," Ji-hoon continued, his eyes still on her hand. "My father does not tolerate traitors." It wasn't just about skimming. Zola's voice was quiet but firm. The Qingdao deal. He wasn't just skimming. He was selling port access schedules and container manifests to the White Tigers. Ji-hoon's head snapped up. His obsidian eyes locked onto hers. The cold indifference was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He had suspected betrayal, but this was treason. The White Tigers were their most hated rivals. "How do you know this?" His voice was cold as steel. He was careless. He mentioned a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, Golden Phoenix Trading. It's a known front for a White Tiger lieutenant, Li Wei. Zola's mind, dormant for so long, was now firing on all cylinders. The analyst was back. "I tracked their capital flows 2 years ago. For the NSA. The admission hung in the air between them. Not just a waitress. Not just a woman who spoke street Korean. An intelligence analyst, a professional." He leaned forward slightly, the first break in his controlled stillness. "The National Security Agency?" "I was very good at my job," Zola stated, a hint of the old bitterness creeping into her tone. "Too good. I was politely and permanently discharged when a name I was tracking belonged to a senator's largest campaign donor. He was silent for a long time, processing. He wasn't looking at an asset anymore. He was looking at an equal, a specialist. 10 years ago," he said, his voice softer now, "on a street corner near Yonsei University. It was raining." Zola nodded, her throat tight. "You looked like you needed a taxi." "My wallet had been stolen. I had no phone, no cash. I was a student then. My father wanted me to understand what it was like to have nothing." A rare, almost invisible flicker of emotion crossed his face. "You gave me your last $20. It looked like you needed it more than I did," she whispered. "I never forgot," he said simply. The words were not a declaration. They were a fact, a debt acknowledged. "You need $8,000 a month for your grandmother's care. The Elysian Fields facility." Zola's blood ran cold. He knew. Of course he knew. In the hour she had been here, he had learned everything. "This is not charity," he said, anticipating her protest. His gaze was direct, unwavering. "And it is not a rescue. It is a business proposition, an alliance. The parks are a symptom of a sickness in my father's organization. Rot, incompetence, betrayal. I am tasked with cutting it out. My methods are direct, but I lack subtlety. I lack the ability to see the patterns you see. I need an analyst." He paused, letting the offer settle. "You will have the title of Chief Financial Analyst for the Quan Group's legitimate holdings. It's a real position. The salary will be more than sufficient. Your grandmother's care will be guaranteed for the rest of her life, paid from a private trust. You will have a security detail. You will have access to our entire global network." He leaned back. "That is what I offer." Zola looked at her bandaged hand. The pain was a dull throb now, a reminder of the price of powerlessness. She thought of Mama Grace, safe and smiling. She thought of the humiliation, the laughter, the camera phone. Never again. "And what do you ask for in return?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. "Your mind," he answered without hesitation. "Your loyalty. I want you to find every snake in my father's garden. I want you to expose them. I want you to help me burn the rot out, from the roots up, starting with Park Min-jun's father." This was the trade, her expertise for his resources, her mind for his muscle. It was a pact with the devil, perhaps, but Zola had learned long ago that angels didn't pay the bills for dementia care. "I have conditions," she said. Her voice had a new weight. The waitress was gone. The analyst was in command. Ji-hoon inclined his head. "Name them. First, my grandmother is untouchable. Any threat to her, real or perceived, and our deal is void, and you will personally answer to me." "Agreed," he said instantly. "Second, I report to you, and only to you, or to the chairman himself, no one else. I am not a subordinate to your captains." "Agreed." "Third, when we find the traitors, their destruction will be my design. You provide the infrastructure, the platform. I provide the strategy. You are the sword, but I will be the hand that wields it." For the first time, a genuine slow smile spread across Kwon Ji-hoon's face. It transformed his cold features, hinting at a warmth buried deep beneath the ice. It was a smile of recognition, of finding a kindred spirit in the most unlikely of places. "Welcome to the family, Zola-si," he said. The next 4 weeks were a blur of transformation. Zola moved from her cramped apartment into a sleek, minimalist penthouse overlooking the Han River, a gilded cage that came with a silent, ever-present security detail. Her uniform was replaced by a wardrobe of tailored suits and silk blouses, but the real change was internal. The fog of survival had lifted, replaced by the sharp, invigorating clarity of purpose. Her new office was a state-of-the-art command center, a digital fortress from which she began to weave her web. Ji-hoon gave her what he promised: unlimited access. She dove into the Kwon Group's labyrinthine finances, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards, the glow of monitors reflecting in her focused eyes. It felt like coming home. She worked with a relentless, obsessive energy. The parks were just the beginning. Zola's analysis quickly revealed that their embezzlement was part of a much larger conspiracy. A faction within the Jeomeon Taeyang, led by Park Min-jun's father, Park Dong-hyun, was systematically bleeding the organization dry, funneling vast sums of money to the White Tigers in preparation for a hostile takeover. They were planning to kill Chairman Kwon and install Park Dong-hyun as the new leader. Ji-hoon would sit in her office for hours, watching her work, a silent, imposing presence. He didn't offer suggestions, he answered questions. He was a living database of the syndicate's history and personnel, providing context for the cold data on her screens. Their conversations were brief, tactical, stripped of all artifice. "Director Choi of the Sumjin Construction subsidiary," she'd state, pointing to a string of transactions. "He's routing kickbacks through a network of shell companies that lead back to Park Dong-hyun. Choi's daughter is married to Park's nephew," Ji-hoon would reply, his voice flat. "A weak man, easily controlled." It wasn't a partnership of words. It was a partnership of action, of mutual, unspoken understanding. Protection was him placing a cup of her favorite tea on her desk when she'd been working for 18 hours straight. Intimacy was the loaded silence as they both stared at a screen, their minds working in concert to unravel a conspiracy that threatened to tear his family's empire apart. One evening, Zola scheduled a solo operation. Ji-hoon's intelligence confirmed that Park Dong-hyun kept a secondary physical ledger in a safe at his private equity firm, Virtue Investments. It was the one piece of evidence she couldn't get digitally. "My men can retrieve it," Ji-hoon stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's too dangerous for you." "Your men look like what they are," Zola countered, not looking up from a blueprint of the office building. "Gangsters. They'll use force. It will be messy and it will tip Park off that we're on to him. He'll destroy everything. I, on the other hand, am invisible." She finally looked at him. "I've been invisible my whole life. Let me use it." He studied her, his jaw tight. He hated the idea. His instinct was to protect, to wrap her in layers of security and keep her far from the front lines. But he also recognized the cold, hard logic in her plan. She was right. His methods were a sledgehammer. This required a scalpel. "You will not go alone," he said, his voice rigid. "I won't be alone," she replied calmly. "I'll be with a bucket and a mop. No one ever sees the cleaning crew." She held his gaze, her own unwavering. "You gave me your word, Ji-hoon. The strategy is mine." It was the first time she had used his given name without a title. The sound of it hung in the air between them. He stared at her for a long moment, a silent battle raging behind his eyes. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. He was deferring to her. She had won. 2 nights later, Zola walked into the Virtue Investments building after midnight, part of the outsourced cleaning crew. She wore a simple janitor's uniform, her hair tucked under a baseball cap. She was just another tired, overlooked worker. She moved through the empty, opulent offices, her cleaning cart filled with more than just soaps and rags. Her NSA training in physical infiltration, long dormant, came rushing back. She disabled a pressure plate under a rug, bypassed a magnetic lock on Park's office door, and used a miniature camera to map the pins in the high-security safe. 20 minutes later, she was walking out with high-resolution photos of every page in the ledger, leaving no trace she had ever been there. It was a flawless solo operation. The information from the ledger was the final nail in the coffin. It detailed not only the full extent of the embezzlement, but also the planned assassination of Chairman Kwan, scheduled for the syndicate's annual foundation banquet in 1 week, and it implicated a dozen high-ranking captains. The threat suddenly escalated. The day after her infiltration, Zola received a notification from the security system she'd had installed at her grandmother's care facility. An unscheduled maintenance van. 2 men trying to gain access to the secure wing. Her blood turned to ice. She immediately called Ji-hoon. He didn't speak. He just listened, his face turning to granite. Before she had even finished the sentence, he was on another line, barking orders in furious, rapid-fire Korean. Within minutes, his men had descended on the facility. The 2 imposters were captured, and her grandmother was moved to a new, even more secure location, known only to Zola and Ji-hoon. That night, he came to her penthouse. He didn't say a word. He just stood in the doorway, his face etched with a silent, cold fury she had never seen before. It was the fury of a man whose promise of protection had been violated. He had failed to keep her safe, and the failure was eating him alive. Zola walked up to him. She saw the self-recrimination in his eyes, the violent impulse he was barely containing. "They didn't get close," she said softly. "Your men were there. My system worked. We worked." She reached out, her unbandaged hand lightly touching his arm. It was the first time she had initiated contact. He flinched, not from her touch, but from the torrent of his own emotions. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. "This ends," he said, his voice a deadly whisper. "At the banquet. It all ends." "I know," she replied, "and I've already designed the stage." She turned and walked back to her workstation, all business once more. "Park Dong-hyun is expecting an ambush. He thinks you'll come at him with guns. He's prepared for a war of muscle. We're not going to give him one. We're going to give him a public execution, and the only blood spilled will be his reputation." She pulled up a schematic of the hotel ballroom where the banquet was to be held. "He believes he is the predator," Zola said, her eyes gleaming with a cold fire. "He's about to find out he's been the prey all along." Ji-hoon watched her, the fury in his eyes slowly being replaced by a chilling admiration. She hadn't been broken by the threat to her family. She had turned that fear into fuel, channeling it into a strategy of devastating precision. He had offered her protection, but in that moment, he realized she was just as capable of protecting him and his entire world. The balance of their alliance had shifted again. They were no longer just partners. They were 2 sides of the same blade. The night of the Jeomin Taeyang Foundation banquet arrived on a wave of cold, crisp autumn air. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of black suits and quiet, dangerous men. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, premium scotch, and unspoken power dynamics. At the head table sat Chairman Kwan, an immovable mountain of calm at the center of the storm, with Kwon Ji-hoon at his right hand. An empty seat was on his left. Park Dong-hyun and his faction were in attendance, their confidence a brittle veneer over their nervous energy. They had swept the hotel for bugs, brought their own security, and were coiled tight, expecting an attack at any moment. They watched Ji-hoon with hawk-like intensity, waiting for the first sign of aggression. The banquet proceeded with its usual solemnity. Speeches were made, toasts were offered. Park Dong-hyun grew more relaxed as the evening wore on. No attack was coming. He began to believe he had miscalculated, that Ji-hoon didn't have the proof he needed. A smug smile began to play on his lips. Then Ji-hoon rose to speak. "Tonight we honor loyalty," he began, his voice carrying across the silent room. "But we also recognize the necessity of change. My father's organization is a living thing. To survive, it must shed its diseased skin." He paused, his cold eyes sweeping the room, lingering for a moment on Park Dong-hyun. "To that end, I have created a new position, a position of absolute trust, to oversee the financial health and integrity of our entire enterprise, to ensure that the blood and sweat of our family is never again stolen by traitors." He turned toward the grand entrance. "Please welcome my new chief financial analyst and the newest member of our family, Zola." The heavy doors swung open. Zola entered. The room, already quiet, fell into a profound, echoing silence. She was not the invisible waitress in a drab uniform. She was a vision of power. She wore a custom-made hanbok, the Jeoggery jacket a deep, lustrous black silk, the chema skirt a cascade of charcoal gray. It was a modern interpretation, severe and elegant. Her hair was styled in a complex, regal updo, and the only jewelry she wore was a single jade pin. Her steps were silent, her posture radiating a command that defied her origins. She walked through the sea of stunned faces, her eyes fixed on the head table. She was the weapon, now unsheathed. Park Dong-hyun stared, his face a mask of utter disbelief. He recognized her. The black waitress. The clumsy servant from the restaurant. It was impossible. His mind couldn't bridge the gap between the woman he had humiliated and the queen who now walked toward him. Zola reached the head table. She bowed respectfully to Chairman Kwon, who nodded in return, a faint, proud smile on his lips. She then took the empty seat at his left hand, directly across from Ji-hoon. The symbolism was devastating. She was their equal. She placed a small, leather-bound notebook on the table in front of her. "Park Dong-hyun-si," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying across the silent room. She spoke in formal, precise Korean. "Do you remember me?" He could only stare, speechless. "You should," she continued, her tone dropping, becoming colder. "You and your son taught me a valuable lesson at Sura. You taught me what happens when men of your station mistake invisibility for incompetence." She opened the notebook. She did not need screens or projectors. Her mind held all the evidence. "On May 12th, she began, her voice a clinical, dispassionate instrument of destruction, you transferred $3 million from a Samjean Construction subsidiary account to a shell company in Panama, Viridian Global. From there, it was routed through 2 other accounts before landing in the possession of Li Wei of the White Tigers." She didn't look at the book. Her eyes were locked on Park Dong-hyun. "On June 3rd, you sold the shipping manifests for 3 cargo containers arriving in Qingdao, detailing our electronics shipments. The White Tigers intercepted those containers. A loss of $9 million to us, a gain of $9 million to them." She named dates, account numbers. "Coded transaction, EADs." She recited the contents of the secret ledger from memory, a flawless, damning indictment. With every sentence, another of Park's allies in the room grew paler, their complicity laid bare. She unraveled his entire conspiracy, thread by treacherous thread. "And finally," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, filled with ice, "the plan to murder Chairman Kwon here, tonight, using a nerve agent to be introduced into his wine by a waiter you bribed." She glanced at a terrified man standing by the service station, who immediately fell to his knees. A waiter who, I'm afraid, has already confessed. Park Dong-hyun was shattered. He looked wildly around the room, but his allies refused to meet his gaze. They were already distancing themselves, rats abandoning a sinking ship. He looked at Chairman Kwon, whose face was an unreadable mask of stone. He looked at Ji-hoon, whose expression was one of cold, final judgment. Then his desperate eyes landed on Zola. "You!" he choked out, his voice trembling with rage and fear. "You're just a black bitch from America, a servant. How?" Zola met his pathetic, hate-filled glare without flinching. She signaled to a waiter, who approached the head table with a tray. On it was a single steaming cup of tea, the Hwagi green tea, the special reserve. The waiter placed it carefully in front of her. Zola picked up the cup, her movements fluid and graceful. Her hand was no longer bandaged. The skin was smooth and unblemished, the faint pink scars a subtle reminder of the fire that had forged her. She looked at Park Dong-hyun, a man who had held the power of life and death, now reduced to a trembling, cornered animal. "Not just a servant," she said, her voice deadly quiet. She switched back to the rough gangster slang of Busan, the language of the streets, the language he truly understood. "I'm the one who owns your entire household now." She calmly took a sip of the tea, the taste rich and delicate on her tongue. It was brewed to the perfect temperature. Then she set the cup down on the table in front of her. The click of porcelain against wood was the only sound in the vast, silent ballroom. It was the sound of a gavel falling, the sound of a life ending. Chairman Kwon gave a single, sharp nod. It was over. Ji-hoon's men moved in, silent and efficient. They surrounded Park Dong-hyun and his named co-conspirators, not with guns drawn, but with a quiet finality that was far more terrifying. They were not being arrested, they were being erased. Justice in this world was swift and internal, 6 months later. The view from Zola's office on the 50th floor of the Quan Tower encompassed half of Seoul. The city sprawled below, a glittering web of light and life. The office itself was a masterpiece of minimalist design: glass, steel, and dark wood. One wall was a bank of monitors, displaying a constant silent stream of global market data and encrypted communications. Zola sat at her expansive desk, not just wearing the title of Chief Financial Analyst, but embodying it. She was in the middle of a video conference, issuing directives to the heads of the Quan Group's European shipping operations in crisp, fluent German. She moved between languages, English, Korean, German, Mandarin, as easily as she moved between spreadsheets. She was integrating the syndicate's shadow economy with legitimate global markets, building an empire more stable and powerful than Chairman Quan could have ever imagined. She was making them bulletproof. Her grandmother was thriving. Zola had visited her that morning. Mama Grace had been sitting in a sun-drenched garden, weaving a basket, a small, contented smile on her face. The fog in her mind had not lifted, but she was calm, happy, and safe. Absolutely safe. The crushing financial weight that had defined Zola's existence for so long was gone, replaced by the satisfying burden of immense responsibility. The door to her office slid open with a soft hiss. Kwon Ji-hoon entered. He still moved with that same predatory silence, but his presence was no longer a source of tension. It was a familiar comfort, the other half of an equation. He placed a cup on her desk without a word. It was Hwagi green tea, brewed perfectly, a small daily ritual, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had been through, an act of protection, an act of recognition. Zola ended her call and took a sip of the tea. "The last of the park assets in Macau have been absorbed," she said, her tone matter of fact. "Full liquidation is complete." "Good," he replied, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at one of her screens, where a complex chart showed the flow of capital from a new competing syndicate. "They're getting bold. They're getting sloppy," Zola corrected him, a hint of a smile on her lips. She tapped a key and a new window opened, revealing encrypted communications she had intercepted and decrypted that morning. A plan, a name, a weakness. "I found him." Ji-hoon read the screen, his eyes narrowing slightly. He looked back at her, and in the depths of his obsidian gaze, she saw it all: respect, reliance, and a profound, unspoken bond that transcended words. He had given her a platform, and she had rebuilt his world. He had offered protection, and she had become his shield. It was not romance, not in any conventional sense. It was something deeper, earned belonging. She was no longer invisible. She was the center of the goddamn universe. He nodded slowly. "Of course you did." The quiet understanding that passed between them was more intimate than any touch, more potent than any declaration. She had not been rescued by a powerful man. She had risen, through her own intellect and will, to become a woman who held empires in the palm of her hand. She had faced down the men who saw her as nothing and had taken everything. What would you have done?